Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a graphic novel comic book that I read. I am back on that comic book grind, and today's comic book is about men without fear and obsessive underworld crime bosses. I am referring to Daredevil Born Again by Frank Miller with art by David Mazzucchelli, among others. This comic book, which was published around 1986, is, of course, I just said it was by Frank Miller. But for those who don't know, Frank Miller is a comic book writer predominantly, also a movie producer, having gotten a lot of his comic books adapted to the large screen. I think I talked about him already when I did Batman Year One, so you can go watch that video to learn a bit more about him. But he's known for writing, of course, Batman Year One, Sin City, The Spirit, writing for Marvel and DC, writing a lot of well-known and well-regarded comics. He's seen as somewhat of a misogynist, and he also self-identifies as a libertarian. And I probably made this joke back in the Year One video, but why not? Let's make it here too. Anyone who identifies as a libertarian, can't be trusted. So that's unfortunate for Frank Miller, even if his work is pretty great. But without further ado, let's talk about Daredevil Born Again. I will do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Born Again begins with Karen Page down in Latin America. She is hooked on different drugs such as heroin and whatnot. And she, in order to get her recent fix, she has decided to sell the alter ego, the information about her, the Daredevil's identity of Daredevil, who is Matt Murdock, who used to be her former lover. And she reveals to this drug dealer, who then goes on to tell Kingpin, Wilson Fisk, back in New York City. And then the story goes on to focus on Matt Murdock and his friends in New York City, where it seems to be an unlucky day for him. He is getting investigated by the IRS, and it appears that he might be getting disbarred soon, as someone has testified that he has been working with witnesses to get them to perjure themselves, among other things. So things aren't really going well for Matt Murdock. He appears to be losing his law license, and he appears to be losing his home and some of his friends. People don't really seem to like him now that they suspect that he might be a bad person. But it's revealed that this is all being orchestrated by the Kingpin, who wants to not only destroy Daredevil, but also the man behind him, in the hopes that he will break him down so completely that when Kingpin shows up to kill him, he won't put up much of a fight. Or Kingpin can use him within his organization once he has successfully worn him down a little bit, which I have to say is pretty ballsy on his part, to just assume that he's going to be able to do that to Matt Murdock, like being able to take a man that you've broken and get him to change his entire philosophy on life. However, as things progress, Matt begins to realize that it's Kingpin, but nobody can really trust him because he's getting incredibly paranoid, and he's starting to behave more aggressively when he's out on patrols as Daredevil, severely hurting the people that are committing crimes, whereas before he would try to get them arrested or something like that. And so Matt is paranoid and angry, and the Kingpin is reveling in this because he knows that he's finally able to take down Matt Murdock, which he's wanted to do for quite some time. Although many of his associates are noting that he should just kill him while he's ahead. Kingpin wants us to enjoy this a little bit longer, but eventually Matt Murdock decides this has to end, and he confronts the Kingpin. But he's so worn out and so like mentally exhausted that Kingpin is able to easily beat him and stuffs him into a taxi cab and launches him into one of the rivers around New York City. And it looks like he's going to die, but Kingpin later discovers that Matt was able to escape out of the taxi cab. Meanwhile, at the Daily Bugle, one of Matt's close friends, Ben Urich, investigates all of this, and he suspects that the Kingpin is behind it. But the further he investigates, the more of Kingpin's allies begin to react violently against him in order to dissuade him from pursuing this investigation. And it works somewhat because Ben Urich is traumatized by these people attacking him and all the deaths that he's witnessing in the process. Meanwhile, Matt, in his kind of disheveled state, is nursed back to life by some nuns, including one nun that is heavily implied to be his mother, although I'm not as familiar with Daredevil comics to say for sure whether or not that's true. In the process, Foggy Nelson, Matt's friend, has been interacting with Ben Urich in an effort to try to figure out what's going on with Matt and who's behind all of this. And Kingpin tries to have Foggy killed by a psychopath, mentally ill hospital patient who's dressed as Daredevil in order to frame Daredevil for this crime. But Matt manages to show up and not only save Foggy, but also Karen, who is being stalked by some of Kingpin's associates. And Karen and Matt have a rendezvous, sort of a reunion where he forgives her for giving up her name and tries to help her get over her addictions and her other problematic mental health stuff that's going on. The Kingpin is angry at this point, and so he decides to contract Nuke, a soldier who has the super soldier serum in him and who is mentally unstable. He sends Nuke to Hell's Kitchen, and Daredevil and Nuke have a very fascinating and very interesting fight, where Daredevil is able to get a lot of good hits in, but Nuke is too strong to be taken down. At that point, the Avengers show up and state that this is a federal matter, so that they're going to intervene in order to save the day. Captain America even takes over and is very frustrated that Nuke is a thing because he was a super soldier, and he's using the serum for good, whereas Nuke is using it for evil. He manages to track down Nuke later and take him down, which they then use to take down the Kingpin and expose his crimes. And although he's able to deal with the legal trouble, like, people know that he's a villain now, and that angers him to no end. And it shakes the confidence of his fellow like board members who are also evil, and so they're like, we don't really trust you anymore. And that makes Kingpin even angrier. And then there's also another bonus comic here where Daredevil faces the Warrior, a sort of a person dressed like a Roman soldier. It's okay, or a Roman gladiator. It's okay. It's nothing to work. I don't really want to talk anymore about that. And so that's where Born Again ends. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to talk about with Born Again here. The first thing I want to talk about is Kingpin, both his plan and also the characterization of Kingpin, because I think Frank Miller does a wonderful job of fleshing out the Kingpin's character if you weren't as familiar with him in the comics. In addition to highlighting his plan and really making it a pretty well considered, well thought out plan, because it really gets at a good way to destroy a hero without having to simply get your hands dirty and walk up to him and kill him. Because it would be very easy to just kill Matt Murdock, and in fact, I think I think Kingpin probably should have did that here. It would have saved a lot of time. But he doesn't want to simply destroy Matt Murdock. He's a man who thinks that New York belongs entirely to him. He's a man who controls a vast amount of people who are afraid of him. And so with that kind of control, he sees Daredevil as like a nasty fly that just won't go away. And so rather than destroy this fly, this person who's been bothering him for a long time, he wants to completely annihilate the idea of Daredevil. Anyone who stands against Kingpin will have not only their persona, like their superhero persona, destroyed, but also their own personal life. Daredevil or Kingpin is trying to destroy the hero as well as the person behind Daredevil. There's an interesting quote about his plan that I would like to read to you. He rides like a fly in a spider's web, my web, thinks the Kingpin, so carefully woven, so neatly placed. His plant at the law library reports to the crime lord of Murdock's days spent working with his partner beyond all fatigue, striving to form a defense against the perfect frame. Photographs taken by telescope, for the man's defenses are yet unknown, provide a stop-motion study of Murdock's deterioration. Most delicious are the nights as low-level stoolies, like distant nerve endings, tell of increasingly violent, increasingly aberrant assaults by a warrior whose fists are no help against the corrosive gas that fills his life. And I gotta say, that's wonderful writing by Frank Miller, highlighting the sick pride that Kingpin takes in destroying Daredevil's life. Like, the man who is so used to using his fist, it's not good enough for a person like the Kingpin who's using his brain in addition to his physical strength. And I feel like this highlights how different Kingpin is from most villains in comic books, who rely on their physical strength to stop the superhero of that they're fighting against. And that's what I really like about Kingpin in general, is because whether he's facing Spider-Man or Daredevil, he's doing his best to use his smarts to outsmart someone who's probably really strong. Like Daredevil has a bunch of sensory superpowers beyond that allow him to counteract his blindness, and Spider-Man uses his web swinging, and Kingpin has found ways to counter both of these villains in different forms of media. So I really like how Frank Miller characterizes this as someone who believes that they have ensnared the Daredevil into a trap and that there's no way out for it. But I also think this shows how like his plan ultimately borders on obsession. By watching the Daredevil and running through the tape and really obsessing over ways that he can destroy this man's life, it borders on obsession. Like I don't think he's thinking quite clearly about this. Even his associates note that, like, you could very easily kill Matt, but he's not doing that because he wants to just fully destroy this person, like physically and emotionally. Kingpin thinks that he's untouchable because he has all this vast power, and as this comic shows, he's not completely untouchable. Daredevil is not completely destroyable either. Like he can be hurt, but he will bounce back because, as Karen Page notes, Kingpin doesn't quite understand the man behind Daredevil. He doesn't quite understand his past, and so although Kingpin thinks he knows everything, it's clear that he doesn't. Another element of this story that I like is the theme of rebirth. So after Murdock's worst moments throughout this comic, after being stabbed and beaten up by the Kingpin, after having everything taken away from him that can be taken away from him, he goes through a period of rebirth or metamorphosis, if you want to say something like that, where the rebirth really happens in the form of a sort of a religious experience where the nuns take him in and he heals and he comes back even stronger than ever. His fighting style changes, where it was more chaotic before. It's more methodical now, and he's clearly thinking about where his hits are going to go. and he's no longer as paranoid. He knows that he has to take down the Kingpin, and he knows exactly how he's doing it. He's strategizing. So the Kingpin is no longer in his head anymore. And it does seem like Karen Page is also reborn. Like she's going to get help for her drug addiction and what else she has going on in her life, which is nice. Although I do think in some element, like to some degree, this demonizes addiction by saying like, oh, your addiction will get so bad that you'll be willing to sell out your friends. And that does happen sometimes, but this is the 1980s. And so I don't want to give this comic the benefit of the doubt. I think it's fair to point out that it's kind of regressive in its opinions of people who are addicted to drugs. I also like the noir feel of this comic. Frank Miller specializes that. You see that in Sin City, as well as Batman Year One, and probably The Dark Knight Returns. But you also see it here with the Daredevil struggling to really find answers to this grand conspiracy about his life. I really like that, and it really helps make this comic feel extra special and very enjoyable to read. I do like the symbolism of Captain America versus Nuke, which is like the America that should be versus the America that is. This feels slightly critical of Reagan's America, because Nuke is initially fighting in South America in wars that America probably doesn't know about, killing a whole bunch of innocent people. He's depicted as doing that. And so I think like in between writing an excellent noir story, Frank Miller is taking the time to criticize Reagan's America, which is pretty wonderful. And although people typically call Frank Miller a fascist because of how he chooses to write his characters sometimes, I feel like that this kind of counterfeits that, or like goes against that kind of notion. And then there's also the elements of religion, which sometimes it does feel kind of superficial. Like the story is called Born Again, and there's nuns, and Daredevil is in Hell's Kitchen. So, but that also just feels superficial. Like there's no deeper meaning. There's no inherent religious message, but there are religious elements there that I do think are worth noting. And then there are a couple things that don't quite feel so good in this comic that I feel hold it back slightly. One of them is it just feels like Matt's wandering around, roaming about pretty early in this comic. They don't really give him much to do other than be paranoid, and I feel like that's somewhat good. But it feels like there could have been more fights or more showing like more of Matt's life. Giving us a better view into who Matt is as a person. Because although I think it does wonderful characterization for Kingpin, not so much for Daredevil or Matt Murdock. I feel like this comic already presupposes that you know somewhat about Matt Murdock, although it does go back into his past, so that's good. But it does so kind of repeatedly, as if it thinks that you forgot who Matt Murdock was in between editions. So maybe a little too much time spent on his origins. Another issue is that it doesn't seem to be like there's any real agency for women in this story. Like Karen Page like sells out her former boyfriend, and then she dies or something. Well, she doesn't die. She like gets attacked and has to be saved by Matt Murdock. There is Gloria, who does seem to have a little bit more agency, but she's depicted as Foggy, or maybe even Matt Murdock's girlfriend or something like that. It's a bit confusing there. But I think there could have been more done for the women here, besides just being there at times. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Daredevil Born Again by Frank Miller. A really solid entry in terms of comic books in general, but also in terms of Daredevil. I have never actually read Daredevil before, so I don't know why I just said that, but I think this is the best Daredevil comic that I've ever read, which is to say it's the only one I've ever read, but it's still really good. I put it up there with like the best that I've read so far. I really like the noir feel. I really like the Kingpin, and the action scenes are pretty intense. So I definitely recommend this to you out there. go seek it out if you can. I think it's going to probably be on my year-end list, unless I read something far better than a lot more better comics or something like that. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about this comic. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this specific story. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and daredevilish travels. Farewell.